Okay, so here's a quick introduction to classical conditioning for the regular psychology class here at AHS. Classical conditioning is also known as stimulus response conditioning, and it was discovered by a guy by the name of Ivan Pavlov. It wouldn't have been possible if he wasn't studying dogs, some really smart dogs, as you might see there. But he was actually studying the digestive tract of the dogs, and he wanted to know what the effect of saliva was on the digestion of the food that the dogs were being presented. Hence the little drooly guy over here as well, because that's what he was really studying, and he rigged up a contraption to be able to measure the amount of drool that the dogs were producing as they were eating their food. Before we get to how it works, there's some vocabulary that you certainly need to know. You need to know the unconditioned stimulus, which is an object that's presented that creates an automatic response in the subject every time it is presented. So for instance, with dogs, they drool every time that they're given food. That's an unconditioned stimulus. Getting a bright light shined in your eyes, your automatic response would be closing your eyes. So an unconditioned stimulus might be flipping on the lights after it's been dark for quite a long time. The unconditioned response is the reaction that occurs, so the eyes closing or the drool or whatever the automatic response happens to be. The neutral or novel stimulus is an object that's introduced that's new. It doesn't originally cause any immediate response in the testing subject at all. It's just a new, oh, what's that? The conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that's been learned as a precursor or a event that happens prior to the presentation of the UCS. So you might want to use a bell before you present the food, or you might want to use a clap before you turn on the lights really quick. Those would be conditioned stimuluses because it's a stimulus that eventually gets learned as a precursor to the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. And then the conditioned response is just the response that occurs when the testing subject responds to the neutral stimulus as if the unconditioned stimulus is going to be presented shortly after. So the formula looks like this, and you'll need to know the formula. The unconditioned stimulus produces the unconditioned response. The neutral stimulus, when paired with the unconditioned stimulus, also will produce the unconditioned response. You always want to produce the unconditioned response when you're pairing the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus has to come first, usually anywhere between a half second and a full second before the unconditioned stimulus is presented. So neutral stimulus, bang, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Shortly thereafter, acquisition will happen, or learning by association will happen, and the conditioned stimulus will become, the neutral stimulus will become the conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response will soon become a conditioned response. And soon you'll be able to clap your hands or ring a bell, and you'll be able to get drool without even having to produce any food. This is how animals are trained quite frequently. So an example, you get some dog food and the dogs drool. Then when Pavlov discovered this, he started to pair the sound of a bell or a tuning fork with the dog food and then measured the drool. And then shortly thereafter he would measure how much drool he would get if he just rang the tuning fork and presented no food. And soon Pavlov learned or found out or discovered that the bell would produce almost the same amount of drool once the stimulus was learned. Another example, here's another example that's my own. Once when I was very, very little, I had the flu. I didn't know I had the flu at the time. Obviously the flu and the flu virus will make you sick. Well, the one thing that I ate just before I really came down with the flu and started to puke was cheese curds. Coming from Wisconsin, eating cheese curds is pretty normal, but I had the cheese curds and I was eating, and I had the flu. I got really, really sick. I threw up. Then every time that I ate cheese curds for a period of about 20 years, I got very sick. I couldn't eat them. I couldn't smell them. I couldn't really have them in sight. If I saw that, I would get nauseous, sick to my stomach, and on some instances even puke because I couldn't eat the cheese curds. One other thing to note is that classical conditioning works really, really well when the experimenter is able to hold the subject captive. If the experimenter is the one running the show at all times, it works really well. You can train friends quite easily by using their favorite candy. If your friends like Starburst, give them the Starburst. That produces a feeling of happiness maybe. You could pair something with that Starburst and get them to do something. Or get them to react a certain way, I guess. And then the concept of nausea and or pain are also very good natural unconditioned stimuluses because it's an unconditioned stimulus. We get sick, we remember that as humans. Pain, we remember that as humans quite well. So I hope that gives you a good introduction to classical conditioning.